What happened? Is this crazy? We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in the history of Make America Great Again. How can you be against it?
Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey here in our newsroom with senior political correspondent Rhonda Colvin and editorial writer and columnist James Hohmann. Hello, friends.
Hello.
2024 is closing out soon, and members of Congress are set to get out of Washington and go home, but not so fast. Of course, nothing is simple. And this is where we play the record like scratching or the wine glass from the Christmas office party falling and shattering all over the ground. Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and J.D. Vance have interrupted the final stage of a bill that would fund the government for 3 months. They have thrown things into chaos, and we are now risking a government shutdown. And did you notice how I ordered those names? Elon Musk first. Is that fair, James?
Today it is. It's the United States of Elon. He's the most powerful man in business, politics, arguably media right now. And I think we're going to end up seeing this as like the apex of his power, because what is happening right now is not sustainable and it will not last. And Donald Trump is the one who actually will be president come January 20th.
We're going to talk more about just who holds the power. I'll note that other rich and powerful tech giants have been making their way to Mar-a-Lago to pay a visit to Donald Trump, to pay tribute in some respects. So today we'll talk about what this moment reveals about something James just said, who holds the power. We'll also cast our eyes ahead to what Washington will look like when the new Congress gavels in come January. They start first, then Trump gets sworn in a few weeks later. Now we know Republicans will control the House, the Senate, and the White House, but who's leaving? And what does the institution of Congress lose as a result of the departures that we'll see? Plus, we'll hear some advice from outgoing lawmakers for their replacements. So let's get started. Rhonda, it is back like a bad penny, the threat of a government shutdown, and also sort of this chaos of last-minute reversals and gear changes as Donald Trump puts his thumb on the scales here and weighs in. Let's just talk about how the spending bill blew up. What's happened?
Yeah, I'll even, go a little bit further to kind of paint the scene for you. When members of Congress came back from the election, they had a long break before the election. The government funding bill was sort of the last thing on the laundry list of things to do, because they had pretty much agreed that they would do a continuing resolution. It's a stopgap measure in order to keep the government funded from December 20th until about March. So they had kind of agreed that we'll do this, a short-term measure. It'll all be good. The main news, of course, has been the confirmation nominees who are seeking confirmation. Also, a lot of the news I'm getting is preparations for the next Congress. So everybody had their, sights on the future. And here we are, a day before the government is scheduled to lose funding with this, 11th hour disruption from the incoming president, also Elon Musk, as you mentioned, and J.D. Vance, of course, with Trump and J.D. Vance putting out an announcement saying that the deal was no good. They want House Republicans to go back to the drawing board. They said that they were Democratic, gimmies and things that were
bells
in there.
And whistles.
Yeah, bells and whistles that were that they didn't like. One of those things is disaster aid for people who live in places that were hit by hurricanes this year, as well as some of the other disasters that happened. So he's saying, scratch all that, figure it out, but we're not doing this. And House Republicans, as they have before, seem to be obeying these commands, which has put everything in an upheaval only 24 hours before the government is set to partially shut down. So that's where we're at today.
And it started with a tweet from Elon Musk.
In the middle of the night, Elon Musk is a guy who reportedly is a heavy user of drugs like ketamine. And he's, there have been graphics that show you basically tweeting at all hours. And all of a sudden, in literally the middle of the night, he starts tweeting up a storm. And over the course of Wednesday, went from being like, this bill shouldn't pass, to this is criminal, to anyone who votes for this bill should lose in 2 years. And he really did. You can see his one of the tweets, and it was this sort of firestorm. There's another, and
I want to just read this one. No bills should pass Congress until January 20th, when Donald Trump takes office.
So, look, I don't know how to make rockets, I wouldn't presume to walk into SpaceX and be like, here's what you all should do to get this off the. But that is exactly what Elon Musk is doing to these members of Congress. It is a cycle. I think Mike Johnson probably, if not for this Elon Musk tweet storm, would have been able to push this continuing resolution through. Trump was sort of fine with it. I think, to your point, Rhonda, he was sort of ambivalent about it.
Plus, he has other things to focus on
Exactly.
come the new year. I mean, he has a really big agenda he wants to tackle. This was just like, get it done and move forward.
And there's
turn the page.
Honestly, look, Trump and Musk are at odds here about what fundamentally they want. In the kind of the optic sense, Donald Trump likes the attention to be on him. He also likes to be the one calling the shots. But more substantively, Trump has sort of used this Musk tweet storm to say, raise the debt ceiling or abolish the debt ceiling and clear the deck for me to be able to come in. To your point, Libby, he wants to get a lot done next year. He wants to spend a bunch of money. He doesn't want to have these fights.
Abolishing the debt ceiling was not on, like, that's
No
not
one-
part
And
of
that's
the
a huge
conversation
deal.
right now.
That-
That's
yeah.
like totally left field thing coming in.
And I should say, I was at the Army-Navy game on Saturday, and I could see Mike Johnson and John Thune, the Republican leader in the Senate, sitting next to Trump for the whole game. It seems like this didn't come up. You know, they were not. This was not something Trump had raised before, and now all of a sudden you have Trump basically saying get rid of the debt ceiling, and Musk is saying let's cut spending. So they're actually pushing in different directions. This like Doge initiative, the Department of Government Efficiency, is aiming to make all these cuts, and Trump is sort of wanting to clear the deck so that he doesn't lose the opening months of his administration fighting what I think a lot of people very close to the president and people who understand Washington want to sort of dispense with. And so instead, he's going to get mired in this new fight and potentially a government shutdown.
What we have to remember is that Democrats still control the Senate, Rhonda. So like there was a negotiation that took place because this does have to have some bipartisan goodwill to get forward, to at least get over the finish line, to take everybody to March.
Yeah, that's right. Again, this was pretty much just ready for passage.
Yeah.
You know, the plane tickets had been purchased.
Right.
Everybody, the holiday parties were happening, and everybody thought that this would be
Like on Capitol
a
Hill,
pretty,
like offices have parties.
Right.
It's like a year-end
Yeah.
celebration.
And it was just,
yeah.
it just felt like this was just one thing to do that they would get done, you know, at the end of this week. But I do want to just to add a little bit more context, the debt ceiling part of this all, with Trump's calls to, you know, raise the ability for the government to borrow.
Or to abolish the debt ceiling.
That is something that takes months of negotiation, usually by the four leaders in Congress, the majority leader in the Senate and the minority leader, and then their counterparts in the House and the president. It is not something you cobble together, or Congress should ever cobble together, in just a couple hours. So just even the fact that that was thrown in the demands right now, and the fact that Republicans are just wondering what to do with this, I really think it shows the disarray that, you know, is happening now, but also maybe a window into what we might expect when he does become president officially.
It seems like Mike Johnson, Speaker Johnson, and Donald Trump were really getting on the same page, and there was some loyalty being built up there. What does this do to Speaker Johnson's power?
This is the vicious cycle. Republicans are going to have the narrowest majority in a century when they take over, really like 2 seats basically, until there are special elections to fill some of the cabinet jobs. Members resign to take cabinet jobs. They're still there right now, but they will resign in January. I think Mike Johnson is in jeopardy. I think his hold on the speakership is tenuous. It is one of the hardest jobs in Washington. He has tied himself as closely as possible to Donald Trump to have Trump's support, and Trump has still continued to support him. But with Donald Trump, you know, he continues to support you right up until he doesn't. And you're absolutely right, Rhonda, that part of the negotiation was because Democrats control the Senate. Part of the negotiation is because there are a bunch of House Republicans who won't vote for anything. And so Mike Johnson had to deal with Hakeem Jeffries and House Democrats because he had a bunch of Freedom Caucus types who were never going to vote for any kind of government funding bill. So then he has to make concessions to get Democrats to vote for it so it can pass the House. And then those hardliners who are never going to vote for it anyway say, oh my gosh, Mike Johnson is a sellout. He's a Republican in name only. We have to topple him as speaker because he's giving all these handouts to Democrats. And when you talk to Republican leadership aides, their view is he had to make these concessions because of you. Yeah. And so they want to rip their hair out right now. There's a lot of frustration. And, all of a sudden you have people who are out there, like Mike Lee gave an interview today, the Republican senator from Utah, where he said Elon or Vivek Ramaswamy, the other Doge co-chair, should be the speaker. The speaker doesn't have to be a member of the House.
Rand Paul's been tweeting that today too.
Marjorie Taylor Greene said it as well.
Okay, so yes.
But and you're Mike Johnson.
Which is true. You don't have to be the speaker. We learned this when Republicans were sort of trying to curry Trump's good favor and saying Donald Trump could be the Speaker of the House a year and a half ago. So truly, it doesn't have to be a House member, but that's so threatening to Johnson.
Doesn't even have to be a member of Congress.
Right.
It could be anyone.
Yeah, right.
But
Elon,
honestly, at the end of the day, you have to operate the government. And you can. I think like Elon. That's my point about Starlink and SpaceX and all these things. Is Elon Musk? He's the richest person in the world. Based on paper, his net worth last week passed $450 billion. It's literally an unfathomable amount of money, nearly $500 billion. He doesn't understand how government works. He doesn't understand what it means for federal workers to not get paid for a month. When he's tweeting things like, "Oh, just shut the government down for a month. Critical functions will continue." He's flying private. He doesn't know what it's like to have a 2.5-hour line at TSA because the government is shut down. And that's I think like these Republican House members are going to go home and get an earful. And they're not all Freedom Caucus types. And it feels like this is all going to backfire on Elon Musk.
A couple of things to remember. There are government workers all over this country.
Yes.
They're not all in Washington by any stretch of the imagination. And troops. And then there's all sorts of government functions that take place that American people rely on. So we're taping this on Thursday afternoon. We'll see where this goes. There could be a lot of games of chicken here, but we are hitting a looming deadline quite soon, Rhonda. Mm-hmm. This has given Democrats some unity of messaging in just even the last 15 hours. I mean, really starting yesterday
last 15
evening.
minutes, I would say.
But I mean, suddenly they have something
time since the election.
Yeah.
Right?
I agree, James.
Yeah.
It's like they finally have something concrete to push back on. Our colleague Annalise Roy talked to Congressman Maxwell Frost, the youngest House member, who was really pulling out this line of Elon Musk is a billionaire meddling in the decisions and lives of all these people. So it's getting them on the same page.
That's correct. And in the last few weeks on the Hill, you have heard Democrats try to figure out, okay, how are we going to make the next 4 years, or at least the next 2 years before the midterm elections work? And there's been a lot of talk about, okay, we need to strategize in ways to become more bipartisan. We need to work together. We need to make sure that that's our public image as well. But because they now see yet another opportunity to have a unified message of saying, okay, no, the Republicans are about to shut down the government. I have heard over the last day Democrats say, okay, we're putting this squarely at their doorstep because we had a deal. We had a deal with Republicans. We were all good, and now we're not. So I think I've even told you guys off camera that I wondered how long the messages of bipartisanship will last, because there will become points where Democrats will say, okay, no, we're not going a step further. And on the Johnson thing, just within, I believe, the last hour, at least this morning, Hakeem Jeffries was asked by reporters, would you help Johnson out if on January 3rd his caucus decides to, scrap his speakership bid? And Hakeem Jeffries said, no, we're not helping him out. Now, again, to James's point, Republicans don't have many choices because they're only going to have at least 2 seats that they can spare when it comes to party line votes. So you're going to have Democrats to help you out. And if Hakeem Jeffries is already saying, no, we're not helping Johnson, that might be it. I think it's a huge sign right now.
And for the last 15 years, Nancy Pelosi has used this dynamic in the Republican conference, really since the Tea Party wave of 2010, to drive a very hard bargain because, just to get a couple of Democratic votes, Pelosi was really good at holding her membership together. And this is, Hakeem Jeffries did hold his membership together during all the votes for Speaker earlier this year. Yeah. And Donald Trump brings chaos. Everything, it's a reminder of, this does it just feels like deja vu.
I want to dwell on Democrats for just one more moment because we are seeing Congress shape up, the Congress that is to be, both in the Republican side of the aisle and the Democratic side of the aisle. We did see some jockeying for positions of power and leadership in Democratic circles. And I want to point out one in particular. AOC, as she's known, of course, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez challenged Jerry Connolly, Democrat of Virginia, to lead the House Oversight Committee, to be the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee. Rhonda, she failed to get enough votes to take over that slot. Connolly's going to do that. He was like next in line. He was the heir apparent. But, interestingly, our colleague Karen Tumulty, who works with James on the editorial side of the House, had a piece this week that cautioned not to misread this as a victory for, as Karen wrote, the mossbacks and old fogies. I haven't heard the term mossbacks probably ever, but this idea of like the old people who are letting the moss grow on them because they're moving so slow. They're like the turtles of the Congress. She had a really different message, that it was about like trying to figure out the ground game and figure out like who could really get the troops in line. What are you watching in terms of these dynamics in House leadership on the Democratic side of the aisle?
Well, if AOC was not elected to be ranking member among her caucus of oversight, I'm also wondering if they are going to utilize her in other ways, if she is also going to be working a little bit behind the scenes to help kind of shape the progressive message in the next 2 years. I think Karen's observations are very interesting and could be spot on. I do think that the Democratic Party in the House, at least, they're still trying to figure out their way forward and who is going to be front and center as their messenger. And they know that I believe AOC is very well respected, actually, which is why I think they're going to utilize her in other ways. But that committee is so powerful and will likely have a lot of big hearings in the next few years where that ranking member will be setting the tone of how Democrats respond in those hearings. I think they may have wanted someone closer to the establishment or closer to the old school Democrats. But again, I don't think it's lights out for AOC by any means. And I think she's also the type of member who seems to understand when her party is strategizing and wants to figure out what their public image is.
There are also some, I'm going to use air quotes here, younger members of the House who are going to be in some leadership positions, like Angie Craig, who is a young 52 years old. She'll be the top Democrat on the Agriculture Committee.
My home district. It's where I grew up in Minnesota.
And she's only been in Congress for a few terms. Like, that's the idea. It's not just young in age.
And she defeated Don Scott. Sorry.
Yeah, great. Please. Yeah.
No, she defeated a much older man who had been around for forever and who was sort of like tired and low energy, and she's going to bring a dose of sort of aggressiveness to that.
Got a youthful 60-year-old who's going to be the top Democrat on natural resources, Jared Hohmann of California. So we are seeing some new faces basically come into leadership.
And actually a bunch. Jamie Raskin is displacing Jerry Nadler. The reason the oversight job opened up is because Nadler stepped aside and Jamie is going to become the ranking on judiciary. So there is, the game has changed. You don't have to have a gavel or be a ranking anymore. AOC very much could run for the Democratic nomination in 2028. She's going to have as big a platform as she wants on TV. She doesn't need to have a committee to be able to do that.
Well, we've been talking about what Congress is gaining, for better or for worse, come the new year. We're going to come back in a moment and talk about what Congress is losing. So stay with us. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. A reminder, you can listen to us on your favorite podcast app, and you can also watch along with us on YouTube. Just look for the Washington Post. So let's talk about who's leaving Congress, and notably the Senate, Rhonda. Who's had your eye, but really on both sides of the Capitol complex, House and Senate?
Well, on the Senate side, they will be losing Mitt Romney of Utah. They will also be losing Sherrod Brown of Ohio and Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who is sort of that complicated figure where people either, love or hate some of the decisions that he made over the last few years, being that key vote in a lot of the major legislation that we've seen.
Oh, he has driven Democrats so crazy at times. He and Kirsten Sinema both.
Right.
And Republicans.
And Republicans, too. But when you look at collectively the people who are leaving the Hill, a lot of them are longtime members. A lot of them have a lot of relationships that have helped usher along some of the legislation people are familiar with. And so you're losing a little bit of institutional knowledge. And I've been actually watching that for the last few terms and elections, is that Congress is sort of bleeding people who kind of know the inner workings, have been able to do all those negotiations we were talking about when we were saying the debt ceiling or the potential government shutdown. So they are losing those types of individuals. Whether or not that will make a huge impact, not sure. I think it would make more of an impact in the House than it would the Senate, but we'll see. We'll see.
You talked to Joe Manchin, as we think of it as like an exit interview, right? What did he talk to you about? What's on his mind as he gets ready for this transition?
Well, I think one of the things that stood out to me is that he is very much defending the reasons why he was that key vote. And he says it was not because he strategized around it. It was because, which is the reaction that the facial gesture you just made is probably the reaction most Americans would have is, oh, wait, that wasn't strategy? But that is what he is saying. And it was more that if you looked at his vote record, even in the Obama era, he stood ground against some of the Democratic proposals then as well. So he said it should have been no surprise that he was this person. But he is also saying that there were examples where you can see that him standing in the way of legislation like the Build Back Better. Remember, he tanked that all in one fell swoop in December of 2021. And a lot of Democrats were really angry with him. But out of that came other, piecemeal legislation and bills that ended up passing, and a lot of people on both sides of the aisle have celebrated. So I kind of, sat down with him to talk about that complicated history of his and what he thinks now looking back.
And he also has advice for those coming in.
He does. And it's advice I've actually heard from other members who are leaving. And that advice is that the only way the Hill works is by lawmakers making relationships with other people that are on your side of the aisle as well as across the aisle, get to know them, and that's how it works. And honestly, that is how it works behind the scenes. It works among staffers, as well, is that people have to know each other. So that's what he said.
Let's listen to some of that interview you did with Joe Manchin.
What's your one piece of advice for the incoming Congress?
Like everybody. Go meet everybody. Sit down, find who their wife or husbands are. Find out what their children like. Find out what their hobbies are. Find something that you can talk on that's not politics. You're human beings. Don't forget that. Oh, you got a title. I'm a United States Senator. Well, God bless you, because the people have put a lot of confidence and faith in you. Or I'm a United States Congressperson. That's wonderful. You're still Joe. You're still whoever.
That's outgoing West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin talking to Rhonda Colvin. I've heard that advice a lot, especially when I was first reporting on Capitol Hill. Like the old guard of senators would talk about how they really felt that loss of collegiality because people go home, quote unquote home. Like they go back to their home districts or home states with such regularity, their kids weren't in school anymore. And I will point out that an artifact from that time is Joe Biden. And that's why you've heard Joe Biden for so many years giving eulogies at the funerals for Democrats and Republicans alike, because he's part of that era of people who invested in the DC relationships, James.
Yeah. I mean, it really is a changing of the guard. We're talking a lot about Manchin and the deal makers, but there are some other really veteran members who are leaving, including Ben Cardin from right next door in Maryland, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He worked with John McCain, he's a Democrat, to pass the Magnitsky Act, which really is super important to sanctioning not just Russian leaders, but authoritarian dictators, preventing them from being able to come to the U.S. and their families, freezing their assets. It was a great piece of bipartisan legislation that happened because these guys knew each other. They had gone on Codels together. Their families knew each other. We're going to have 14 new senators next year. I went and counted, and that includes whoever replaces Marco Rubio, who's going to become Secretary of State, and J.D. Vance, who's going to become Vice President. I want to say, though, we're getting some impressive new members. And
some are coming from the House.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the changing of the guard isn't necessarily all bad. I mean, it is a lot of turnover. And, a lot of times it always feels like it just we're moving toward more discord and polarization. But we're going to have two new African-American women who are both very impressive. Angela Alsobrooks, who's replacing Cardin in Maryland, Lisa Blunt Rochester, who is just elected in Delaware. Other people, as you mentioned, who are already household names like Adam Schiff from California. So it's people who sort of know their way around the Capitol. Lisa Blunt Rochester, a congresswoman now. But we are losing a lot of institutional memory. People like Debbie Stabenow, Mitt Romney.
I will say Democrats from rural states or states that have a huge rural population like Montana, right?
Yep.
Like John Tester. Like, so those Democrats from rural parts of the country are becoming a rarer and rarer breed.
And that's a great observation to make because it does show you sort of the issues that the Democrats are facing when they have to reelect someone in a rural district or a state, and that some of those climates are working against people like Sherrod Brown, who was actually very well liked in Ohio. But in this last election, because Trump, I remember seeing ads for Marino, who will be the incoming Ohio senator. It was just Trump talking directly to camera saying, vote for Marino. Marino was not even in the ad. He wasn't in many ads, actually. But
It was Sherrod Brown versus Trump.
Right, exactly. And we see that over and over again in other places. John Tester is another example of that.
I'm glad you brought up Sherrod Brown. I wanted to play a little bit of his farewell speech. Senators have a tradition of giving a final speech on the floor of the Senate. And it's really, for members of both parties, it's really a moment to pause because families and staff will come. And often senators get emotional as they thank their staff, as Sherrod Brown did, as he recognized the team that's helped him. But I want to play part of what he said because he has a very populist message that is very in line with what you might hear from Donald Trump right now. But of course, he couldn't get reelected. So let's listen to Sherrod Brown.
I've always looked at things a little differently, perhaps, than some. To me, politics is not really left or right or liberal or conservative. It's really about whose side you're on and whom you're willing to. It's about whom you're willing to fight for, whom you're willing to stand up to. That's what true populism is all about. True populism lifts all people. True populism doesn't tear others down. True populism doesn't play to race and division. True populism is essentially about the dignity of work, putting workers at the center of all we should be doing.
Senator Sherrod Brown giving his farewell speech in the Senate. Rhonda, I mean, this was his ethos. This is what he's done his whole career. And now populism was sort of flipped against him.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And like I said, I think Trump's popularity in Ohio is really what hurt Sherrod Brown. I think a lot of people in Ohio often voted for him because he was almost like a folk hero, to be honest. I remember going to a campaign event for Tim Ryan. If you remember, he ran for Ohio Senate and J.D. Vance beat him. I remember this woman came up to me and I did an interview with her about her support for Ryan. And she's like, do you know who's coming? And I'm like, who? And she's like, Sherrod. And I'm like, she spoke with him about like he was some sort of celebrity. And she's like, I'm so excited. And he was not the main event. Yeah. But the fact that he came in just to shake a few hands before Tim Ryan got on stage meant a lot to a lot of Democrats and independents in Ohio. Another thing that keeps coming to mind when I look at the turnover in the Senate especially is a lot of people don't realize that when you elect a new person, it kind of resets everything for your state. Sherrod Brown is someone who probably could walk across the aisle, strike a deal with a Republican, and get something for Ohio. Moreno is going to have to start from the ground up and build relationships, and that usually takes years.
And they're going to get another new senator too.
I mean,
J.D. Vance is going to create a vacancy.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so that's going to happen in Montana. It's going to happen in any place where you had an incumbent who was there for years.
But Ohio's going to be like double junior.
Exactly. Double junior. Exactly.
A couple points I wanted to make about Sherrod Brown specifically. That Ohio Senate race this year was the most expensive in history. $483.4 million were spent on TV ads in Ohio this year. $251.3 million by Republicans, $232.4 million by Democrats. To Rhonda's point, Sherrod Brown outperformed Kamala Harris by 2.5 points, but Trump won Ohio by 11 points. The best anyone did in the kind of the Democrats running in places Trump won was John Tester, who ran about 8 points ahead of Harris, but she lost by more than that, and it wasn't enough. We're in this age where people like Bernie Moreno are coming in as a basically generic Republican for the first time in since the direct election of senators, there are only going to be 3 states this coming year where both parties have a Senate seat. Only Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Maine. Not that long ago, it was 27 states. Stunning. And something else that was really striking, I was reading the Cook Political Report, and they had something about Senate races this year that Republicans were actually shockingly close to winning 55 Senate seats. They ended up with 53. But Jessica Taylor calculated that another 47,000 and some odd votes would have flipped Wisconsin and Michigan. And it would be just a very different environment. And if you include Nevada, where the Democrat only won by 24,000 votes, 71,000 votes is the difference between 53 seat majority, 56 seat majority. That could end up being hugely consequential as you start to talk about confirming Trump's nominees.
Wow. I want to play one more piece of tape, and this is from Mitt Romney, also leaving, senator of Utah. He gave his farewell speech on the Senate floor, talking about how much he admired these individual characters and sort of American heroes from history, right? These singular figures like George Washington and so on and so forth. But he's like, I'm a team player, and what we do here is really a team. It's a team sport, not a solo sport. And so we talked about how collegiality has really driven what he thinks he accomplished in the Senate. Let's listen.
During my first months in the Senate, I was mostly on my own and thus mostly unproductive. And then Lisa Murkowski invited 5 Democrats to join with 5 Republicans in her home for takeout dinner. With COVID then active, we were spaced far apart, with windows open despite the winter cold. Our conjecture on how to bridge the impasse between the president and Congress on COVID relief led us over the next several weeks to dig in, negotiate, draft, and eventually see our work become the basis of law. I was fortunate to also be a part of what this team worked on that followed: the bipartisan infrastructure law, Electoral Account Act reform, gun safety legislation, marriage legislation that included religious protections.
That's Mitt Romney giving his farewell address on the floor of the Senate. You know, we left that tape a little longer there to allow room for that listing of laws that were passed, bills that were passed, because it really is, if you look back at how rancorous this time has been, how fractured our politics are, there has been bipartisan achievement and accomplishment. And I wonder how, I'd love to talk in an episode in early January about how Americans are viewing that perspective of, do they see the bipartisanship?
They clearly don't.
Yeah.
I could just say one quick thing and then I'll start.
Please.
So 5 of the 10 people that Romney's talking about, including himself, are not going to be there next year. Either they lost, they're retired. Manchin and Sinema didn't run for re-election. Tester lost. Romney's going. Rob Portman retired. And so the people who are getting elected are the smash mouth types.
Yeah. Which is exactly why that public perception of what Congress has or has not done, that it's probably due to a lot of that. Because, and I think about this a lot, while walking on the Hill, is that people often don't know of the things that aren't getting, the big headlines, and some of the things that aren't getting the headlines are really boring. But they are keeping the lights on in this country. They are, the infrastructure bill, of course, that Biden had a hard time telling people that, he did. It's because
can I just say, Rhonda, I was driving last weekend and I saw a very tiny sign on the side of a highway being this is brought to you by the bipartisan infrastructure law. I'm paraphrasing here. But there was no Joe Biden did this or the senator of Pennsylvania did this or it is the taking of the credit is part of lawmaking. That's part of being able to run and get reelected and show people. Yeah. And there's been obviously some failure in messaging. But who does it benefit to talk about bipartisanship, right? Yeah. Who does it benefit? Who does it hurt? And in this case, Mitt Romney's proud of it and talking about it, but he read the writing on the wall and realized there wasn't really a place for him in the Senate any longer. Fair to say?
Yeah. And I think he also said that when he wrote his retirement letter announcing that he wouldn't seek reelection. And a lot of members who have left have been upfront about that. If you guys remember, there were Republican members of the House who left. They said they were retiring, and then they left even before that, their last days. So, and it's because it's a hard environment to work in. It's a hard place to be reelected on, the things that you have done for your community.
Or just feel productive. Or just feel productive.
Look at the chaos right now, right?
Yeah.
Like, look at what's happening with Elon Musk is attacking members by name. He's lying about what was in the continuing resolution and saying it had $3 billion for a football stadium in D.C., which it had $0 for. And so you're just a member, and it's just like, come on, you're just putting up with this nonsense. You can understand why people would be like, I could just go make a lot of money working at Palantir or whatever.
And not to get, too philosophical too, but I think there's a role for us as journalists too, is to tell, even if it sounds a little boring to discuss, I mean, I'll discuss it all day with anyone, but if it sounds boring to talk about the debt ceiling or what's really in the CR, we still need to do it.
Absolutely.
Because in that CR, there is aid for people who are, still feeling the effects of Hurricane Helene that happened and hit North Carolina pretty bad. I know Tom Tillis, who's the senator from North Carolina.
Republican.
Yes, Republican, doesn't seem too thrilled that this is now being targeted. And, there's been this upheaval when his state really needs those funds. So we also have to look at the bigger picture, too, that sometimes people aren't getting the full message because they're just getting that truncated piece that sounds, kind of dramatic and interesting, but there are so many other things that happen on the Hill that should be amplified.
Yeah, drama is dramatic, right? I mean, it pulls us in, but there's a lot to be said for just getting the work done, right? Making the time to make the donuts, as the old Dunkin' Donuts commercial was.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
I like time to make the donuts more myself, but
time to make the donuts.
Make the donuts, make the donuts.
That's what I used to say when I woke up to write the Daily Show too. Time to make the donuts.
That's great. I say it to myself many a morning. So as a final segment today, we're going to pivot here and end where we began as a podcast. We started this podcast Sidebar back in April as Donald Trump was facing a trial in New York. And it looked at that time like he very well could face and probably would face 4 trials. That has all changed. And the latest news in Donald Trump's really good fortune in the legal sense is breaking today in Georgia. A state appeals court removed Fani Willis, the DA there, from the election interference case against Donald Trump and others. Now, they did not dismiss the indictment.
Right.
So what happens next, James?
Well, now there's like a panel that is basically controlled by the Republican governor. This is one of the Fani Willis had attended a fundraiser for a candidate who was running against one of the people that she wanted to indict. And so that case has sort of just been waylaid because they haven't found a special prosecutor. So basically this, even though the indictment is still active, it means that this is going to sort of languish indefinitely and probably mean that Donald Trump will never face trial in Georgia.
Now, there are all these co-defendants, though, so this is potentially very important to them, Rhonda.
Mm-hmm. There were, I believe, 19 altogether with Trump included. And then remember, you also had a few who took plea deals early on. So this case, I just keep going back to this, that when we were reporting on it in the early days, it felt like the one case out of the 4 that really had legs, that really had it started moving early on. We might be living in a different universe at this point. But here again, we see kind of an ultimate nail in the coffin of this case by disqualifying Fani Willis, who put the case together.
And it should be said, showed poor judgment. I mean, it is, Donald Trump has been so lucky in who's come after him just because so many times it's imploded. And she clearly had a personal relationship with Nathan Wade. There's dispute over the particulars and when it started and when it ended. But she hired this guy and gave him a very lucrative contract that paid him hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the result of her bad judgment is this very strong case is never really going to come to fruition.
When you talk about how different that could have turned out, it just goes to show that in a parallel universe, I mean, that Georgia case could have been one of the biggest stories of the year. So next week on Sidebar, we're going to be back on Boxing Day, and we're going to talk about what were the biggest stories of 2024. We'll also do a little bit of like a parallel universe, what could have happened, but we're going to mostly base ourselves in the reality of the biggest pivotal moments that have laid the groundwork for 2025 and the political and policy era that is to come. So join us on Thursday, Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, as we review 2024. It has been a ride, folks. So come with us for one last time. For Rhonda, James, and myself, we say thank you, happy holidays, and we'll talk to you next week.